Good evening. As many of you will have gathered, I'm not Damien Webb. I'm Phillipa McGuinness, and I'm co-editor with Richard Neville of the library that made me 200 years of the State Library of New South Wales. Unfortunately, Damien couldn't be with us tonight, so I am standing in, not that anyone can stand in for Damien Webb. I'm wanting, of course, to begin by acknowledging country, and these are, in fact, words that Damien wrote. The State Library of New South Wales stands on the timeless sandstone of Gadigal country. We acknowledge the many Aboriginal peoples and nations across the state as the ancient and ongoing custodians of their unceded lands, waters, and skies. We remember that this place sits on Gadigal country and is built from it. The sandstone that was mined from below now forms the library's walls, but it was once the soft sand on which ancestors walked. We offer our profound respects to the many generations of Aboriginal elders, leaders, storytellers, warriors, creators, and healers. We are honoured to hold their stories, languages, and histories here at the library. And we pay our respects to all First Nations people, especially those who are with us tonight.
Okay, so this is obviously, if you see a minty green, as I now know it's called, a minty green colour, that signifies that the library has turned 200. And so this is our year of our bicentenary, I suppose. And there's going to be a lot going on this year, so look out for our website so that you can see all the things that are going to be presented. But this series, this is the first of a series of lectures that we've put on, that Daniela, my colleague, and I have curated for the kind of Mitchell Librarians lecture series. They're the second Tuesday of each month, so look out for the web and you can see what we're going to be talking about. Literary archives is the next one. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things, including behind the scenes, like conservators and people who catalogue, the engine room of the library, which often gets overlooked when we celebrate them. So keep your eye out, and please, we look forward to seeing you the second Tuesday of each month. And I will start by also acknowledging Lord Glendon Brooke, who has been a very generous supporter of this library. He helped underwrite Reading the Rooms, which is a book published here in 2023, and he has indeed also underwritten The Library That Made Me, and obviously Lord Glendon Brooke's support comes through the Library Foundation, which has also been an integral part of indeed this entire year. So Pip, maybe we can explain how it all came together, this book.
Yeah, so it's almost hard to know where to begin with this book because it's a hybrid book. It's unusual, and I would say this because I'm the editor, but it's definitely greater than the sum of its parts. And what I love about the book is that it's about this library and the fact, as Richard writes so beautifully in his substantial essay in the book, that this library, nothing about it was inevitable. People keep using the word convoluted to explain how we got here, and that is certainly the case. So the library consists of Richard's essay that we're going to talk about, I hope, in quite a lot of detail. Yep. I have so many questions, and even though I'm closely, intimately familiar, you might say, with Richard's research and work for the essay, there's a lot, of course, I don't know. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk, and in fact I'm going to read a little bit from Damien Webb's essay, which some of you might have read an extract from in the Sydney Morning Herald today. It's online, and an editor at the Herald told me that it's getting an incredible number of eyeballs. So many people are engaging with the history of the bronze doors. Then I'll talk a little bit about the library that made me, the idea, and how it's rippling in many forms and on many platforms across the year. And then we might answer some of your questions.
Absolutely.
So I think I'll start by reading a little bit from Damien's essay to give people a bit of a sense of it, very briefly, and then we'll talk about how it came about. But I've made this point on a number of occasions about the stained bronze doors. The name of his essay is Stained Bronze, which, for anyone who has read it will appreciate, has a very confronting double meaning. But there are very few pieces where you read something and it changes your mind so deeply and affects how you think about things every day. His essay starts with this question: you've likely walked past them countless times, but have you truly seen them? The massive bronze doors guarding the entrance to the State Library's Mitchell building seem like timeless sentinels of history and culture, yet have only stood since 1942. Pressed into their metallic surface are dozens of images of Aboriginal people, many drawn from the library's photographic collections. These figures have silently witnessed millions of visitors passing over the library's threshold, but how many have noticed them? Despite their imposing size and intricate detail, the doors seem to vanish when they are open. They fade into the shadows of the grand entrance hall. This perhaps explains why their complex and troubling history has remained relatively unknown. So Richard, when you first spoke to your colleague Damien, our colleague Damien, about the work and research that these, early paragraphs suggest, what was your response, particularly in the context of the 200th anniversary?
So obviously we were very aware with 200 that it's both a celebration of what the library has achieved and done over the past 200 years, but our collections are also points at which need some reflection, and they're not these kind of neutral repositories of the past or neutral records of the past. They're very kind of nuanced. The way people have looked at them have changed over what people thought our collection said in 1900 or 1910 is very different to what someone in 2010 would have thought they would have meant. So when Damien came to me with the question about the doors, what intrigued me was not only do we have the doors, which I suppose you've all kind of walked through as you came in today, but we actually had an archive, a corporate record, I suppose, if you like, of how the doors came together. And so to have such a complex record of artwork commission is actually really kind of rare. So to me, and reading through, as Damien began to read through this little bundle of papers, it became very clear that the man who commissioned them, William Ifold, who was the sort of dynamic principal librarian at the time, had really kind of curious and potentially quite conflicting view of what the doors were going to be. He was very initially they were going to be printers' marks and European views and so on, but he thought that, well, okay, I want to put some Aboriginal figures on these doors, and in a sense it was because he saw them as a dying race, and this was going to be the record of them. That was the first time that Aboriginal people had appeared as public art. But then as you get, and so in that sense it could be seen as quite celebratory and a very positive image. But as you get into the archive, he's kind of questioning, well, we don't want Sydney blacks, he says, we want people from the desert, we want full bloods. I mean, it's really kind of quite, in these days, quite sort of confronting language. But so to me, when Damien sort of came with this idea, it seemed to me a perfect way for the library to take some serious scholarship that Damien had done, because it's very kind of detailed work, and reflect upon what the library itself means. I mean, it is a perfect example in a way of the complexities of things like our collections, because on the one hand they seem these, and they're very impressive things, you know, I think most people would walk past them and feel the kind of the weight of their design and so on. But on the other hand, for a First Nations person, an Aboriginal person, they represent something completely different and a very sort of idealised history, I suppose, but also quite a savage history in, you know, the way Ifold and his contemporaries are describing how they're going to put these doors together. So to me, it kind of was the perfect example for the book on the complexities of our collections. And, you know, we have spent probably since the 1960s really looking through our archives for Aboriginal voices, Aboriginal presences. We know there's huge gaps. We know the violence that was committed is often alluded to but never explicitly stated in archives. So it just, to me, seemed to sum up in a fairly neat way a really interesting perspective on why our collections matter. And I think the way Damien approached it it's a very compelling read.
It certainly is, and it's layered with nuance in ways that are really engaging and inspiring, because he's in his own workplace, and he would say this if he were sitting here, investigating part of the structure of his own workplace, using archives in his own workplace that have rarely been touched or opened, that are all generated by a figure, the former State Librarian Ifold, whose name would not be widely remembered now, but he's grappling with all this, and also with the question, what do we do with this knowledge?
Yeah, and I think Ifold himself, you know, he was a interesting man. He was dynamic. He was very opinionated. I mean, most of the design you see around this building, the marble, the Tasman map, the kind of friezes around the outside, the grand reading room, was all under Ifold's direction. And he was very clear that the architecture of the building had to reflect the importance of what libraries were. And he'd seen bronze doors when he'd travelled in Europe. He knew that, and in America, he was particularly taken with American library design. So he wanted this library to have good art on its own. So there was a real kind of deliberate, he was articulating what he considered to be the importance of libraries. And he says you know, he had a huge fight. He was always fighting. He's a fighter. And he was fighting with the government architect he said the government architect wants the foyer to look like a commercial bank, and it's more than a bank. You know, he was getting very cross with commerce, and he was quite a character. But he, you know, we have this archive, and he was writing to everyone. He was a great letter writer, and which is lucky for us. And so Damien came across this archive that I don't think actually anyone had ever really looked at. And so it was the perfect way of him as a First Nations man looking at this institution and wondering about its colonial past.
Yeah, and discovering along the way that a lot of the images and other things recorded in the archive are deeply inappropriate, which is an understatement. And one of many ways in which we can exemplify this is simply by noting that we know Ifold's name, we know the government architect's name, we know the anthropologist at the Australian Museum who criticised some of the approaches. We know Daphne Mayo, one of the artists who was commissioned and then decommissioned. We know her name. we don't know the names of any of the Aboriginal people who appear on these doors.
Yeah. There was absolutely no consent given whatsoever. And they were basically anthropological photos of what he considered, sort of uses the word, sort of pure bloods, or people who were, sort of living in the desert country. And he takes their photos. They would have no knowledge at all that they are on these doors. And, he notes at one stage there's a woman with a young baby, sort of breast exposed, which was kind of something you'd never do for a European depiction. And the girl would have been 18, the baby would have been 18 by the time the doors were commissioned. So it's a really interesting, complex history, which I think exemplifies Australia's complex and challenging history. So,
and I know I'm very proud to be associated with a book that includes such scholarship, which is a kind of a segue to your essay, Richard, which also includes some really outstanding scholarship based on deep research. And I'm sure you won't mind me saying that where my desk is, it's quite close to your office. And it was my job, one of many jobs, to try and get all the material in this book to the publisher on time so that the book could be published to coincide with the launch of the library's 200th anniversary. So it was launched very gratifyingly by the Governor-General a couple of weeks ago. But books take a long time to put together, and at some point between us deciding on what the book might look like and getting a contract and commissioning it, I noticed that you started listening to music through your headphones quite a lot in your office, and people would say, Richard's writing the history of the library. It was no easy task.
No, I mean, yes, that's true. I've discovered my headphones for the last 6 months or so, and Pip, I thought Pip was going to say she was always harassing me to finish the damn thing, which is also true because it did need a bit of encouragement. Trying to write 200 years of an institution fairly quickly is actually quite challenging. Trying to write the history of an organisation, of which one has been, I worked out today, I have been at this library for 17% of its 200 years. So, which didn't take much.
How many, I'm sure the room is full of mathematicians,
so it's
who can work that out.
36 years. And I did use a percentage calculator to do it. I didn't do that myself. But particularly, say, the recent history is a really hard thing to write about because, I could say an awful lot that would be defamatory. So, but that's kind of not the point of the book in a way. You're trying to, it has been a convoluted, and there were moments when the library despaired of itself and what it could achieve. In the 70s, it felt it had lost relevance, that no one came to it. It was overcrowded, the staff weren't paid enough because university libraries had started to pay more than the staff here. So we weren't attracting the right people. There were periods in the 1880s when the building, which was on Bent Street, where the Aurora Place now is, when that seemed to be falling down, and the longest complaint for a public building, I think, starts in 1870, and this wing was finally completed in 1942. And every year it seems the trustees were saying, "Can you just fix the thing?" But so I suppose it was the kind of people knew the beginning of the library, so it's probably worth just quickly. The library started as a subscription library, and we kind of think that libraries are these ubiquitous things that have always been with us, and we have always had libraries, but we haven't always had free and public libraries. So really, in the early 19th century, particularly in Britain, if you wanted a library, you really had to join a subscription library, which in other words meant you had to pay to belong, kind of thing. So the subscription library here begins in 1826, very much as a kind of gentleman's library. Well, not completely as a gentleman's library. You had to pay £5 to join, and then £2 per annum to maintain your membership, which of course immediately excluded most of the Sydney population. And also, even if you're a rich emancipist or you're a rich shopkeeper, you weren't allowed to join either. So you could be blackballed. So there's, I don't know if people are aware of blackballing, but essentially it means you have to put your name forward as a member of the club, or in this case a library, and you can be anonymously refused to join. It was a very big thing in English clubs, clubland. So that was actually quite a disincentive for people to join, because they thought, oh, if I put my name forward and then people find out. And people were excluded, but particularly it seems for progressive politicians were excluded. But however, it begins as a gentleman's club. It never really works because not enough people join. It's in perpetual debt. Women aren't allowed to join initially. It's an exclusive. It's never really clearly stated, but nowhere are women allowed. Does the initial kind of discussions the library refer to women, and then in 1846 it clearly says women are allowed to join, although women quite sensibly don't seem to bother joining, because they probably think, why would I? But it does think it doesn't agree with fiction. So there are all these kind of fiction is for the maids. Your maids will read fiction. Gentlemen did not, and so that was another problem, because it had books that no one wanted to read. So by 1869, the whole thing has kind of fallen. It had built this Bent Street Library across the way. They'd got into huge debt, which they could never overcome. And by they keep on going to the government for money, saying, "Will you buy us out?" And the government would say, "Well, if you let," because it wasn't a public library, so it wasn't letting the public in. So the government refused to buy this, and they had actually given it some money, so that was always a point of contention. In 1831, Governor Darling had given it some money and some land, so people, well, okay, you've given us money, this library has been supported by the government, therefore people need to be able to use it. It won't budge on, the subscription library won't budge on letting the members of the public in, so in 1869, the whole thing falls into a heap, and the government buys it and it becomes the Free Public Library, which is what we now know. But we do keep all the subscription library collections, so that's why we say that we're 200 years old. I think that's a fair claim. The first trustees say, well, it now changes its complexion completely. It's a public library aimed at working men. Working men have not, and again, it's quite a gendered thing, working men have no other access to information, so they should be privileged in this library. And then they get rid of the fiction. There is fiction in the collection. They decide fiction is not appropriate in a public library, so it's given to the Sydney Infirmary or Sydney Hospital, and also to Gladesville Mental Institution, which always seems to me, if you think fiction is bad for people, why do you actually give it to people who are unwell? But anyway, and then it kind of has this rolling, it begins very early on to see itself as a national library and as a library that collects Australiana. And even before David Scott Mitchell comes into the picture, who we all know is this great collector. I mean, he's in fact one of many collectors, and then it kind of assumes this role as a national library. But I suppose what surprised me, libraries really, they're probably better on the continent and in America, but they don't really get going even in England until after the later part of the 19th century. And really for this country, the library network is terrible until the 1930s, and the Carnegie Institute Foundation comes and does a report on libraries. It says that Australia has one of the worst library systems it's ever seen. And so for this state, in 1939, there's something passed called the Library Act, which is a formula that allows for funding for libraries, for public libraries across the state. And obviously the war gets in the way, but after the war, the public library network that we now know takes off. And so what we think of being something that's always been with us is in fact, I think, one of the great achievements of post-Second World War. And the Second World War, and indeed the First World War, people do begin to see libraries as these agents of change. They're going to educate the masses. I mean, there's all these things, do you open on Sundays was a big thing in the 1870s. And the clergy said, well, can't open on Sunday because how are people going to go to church? And you kind of think, well, probably most working men didn't. And the library says, well, working people, how else are they going to get to the library unless they can come on Sunday? So probably the first Sunday it opens, very few people turn up. So the answer seems to be no one comes to the library on Sunday. But, there are all these questions. Should we have fiction? What does fiction mean? It's a really interesting and quite surprising history that, thankfully Pip didn't make me stop, because I think I could have kept on going. And it's always, my colleagues who are here today will know that we're always discovering something new that you think, oh, bloody hell, if only I'd known that for the book, that would have been great.
So what's an example of something that you thought, oh, I wish that had gone in the book? Or are you just planning the next book, which will be,
the sequel,
perhaps, a longer history of this institution?
I think sort of several things. One of the things that did intrigue, I'll answer that in two parts. One of the things that did intrigue me was just how the questions we ask about information and knowledge rarely change. So in 1896, the first library conference in Australia was held, and I've forgotten who writes it, but he says, this is in 1896, at present the world was so deluged with literature of all kinds that the management and organisation hitherto applied to libraries seems likely to be overwhelmed. With such a surfeit of literature, it was desirable that every possible means should be taken to secure people from books of no use to them or of a baneful influence. And that sounds like something that the social media ban would have been saying, just recently. So, there was this sense, okay, we've got too much information in 1896. And the other thing that I thought, in 1898, people are getting very anxious about newspapers. The paper usurps the place of books and to a large extent of periodicals, the newspapers. And many people read nothing but the stories in newspapers, causing the mind to become demoralised, gradually losing the power of concentration or continuous thought. The mind loses the power of discrimination, the taste is lowered, and the mental appetite becomes diseased, which is what I think most people would now say about TikTok or Instagram. So I think you get this long sense that there is anxiety about information always. The questions in 1898 were very much around, how do you have a common catalogue? How should we have standards that we can all share? The kind of things that we would now talk about, when we are wondering about digital, how we all going to have the same digital standards kind of thing. So how do you collect? We still collect. We still do the fundamental things that were done, 100 years ago. But I suppose there are other things that my colleague Linda, who was sitting here, Sir William Dixon was one of the other great benefactors of this library. David Scott Mitchell and Sir William Dixon are two of the great collectors, very intelligent men, both bachelors, often argued confirmed bachelors, but never really clear. And Sir William Dixon sort of took on the role that David Scott Mitchell had of being a beneficent collector. And William Ifold actually says he's kind of a peculiar fellow, but he's very useful. And we'd always wondered why he gave the library so many paintings. And then it transpires that it was Deramat, wasn't it, Linda? I think there's a painting turns up by a man called Benjamin Dutereau of a Port Phillip Aboriginal man called Deramat. And it's announced in the paper that Sir William Dixon has acquired this thing. And in fact, going through the files, and the files are just these amazingly, tantalisingly so intriguing. And Ifold has obviously said to Sir William Dixon, I've seen this painting, and you should buy it and then give it to the library, which is unstated. And Sir William Dixon has obviously said, no, I'm not really interested. And then Ifold writes back to him and said, no, you must buy this painting. And you kind of think, wow, these kind of transactions that are going on behind the scenes. And look, it's not a huge story in one sense, but it does explain so much of how the library kind of gets its collections. But there's also the underside of collections, like library deposit, sort of library deposit, legal deposit rather, asking for socialist newspapers. We tend to think about, when we think of collecting, all the grand stuff, the First Fleet journals or the paintings of Deramat and so on. But the library's always been this kind of omnivorous collector of all sorts of things. And it's been, I think that's what makes it such a rich collection.
I mean, what strikes me sometimes as I read your essay, it's like you've got these big alpha male personalities, wealthy men who are kind of trying to prove themselves to posterity or to each other, but we're the beneficiaries of that in many ways. But also I think it's easy, as you say, to think of collecting as being quite a passive thing, things just land. But in fact, Ifold in this example was maybe that's putting it too manipulating, encouraging, strongly suggesting to people, to these, those in his orbit, that they donate certain things or bequeath certain things to the library. But that continues. Like, it's not all, through the library's collecting policies. And you trace some of these, the way that changed, particularly in the 20th century. It's often very active, concerted, deliberate, trying to fill gaps in the collection.
And I think that is a really big part of what we do. I mean, I think particularly, probably since the sort of 1970, well, I think we've always been aware that the library has had gaps, but I suppose when the library begins the Mitchell Library begins, I should say, in 1910, and it is worth noting that there are all these alpha males, but there are also these women who really are the engine room of much of this activity. And, the famous story of Nita Kibble, who was the first female employed here, she applies to be a library attendant, and she just says she's NB Kibble. So they automatically assume she's a man, because why else would someone be applying to join the library? And it transpires when she turns up that she's in fact a woman, and she comes first in the test, and then after a lot of soul searching they take her on. And she's the first of many women who are really the kind of people who Anderson, who's one of the great or very interesting principal librarians, says, well, they're cheap and they don't get married, so they, it's kind of the language around it is really quite anxious. And Ifold's very cross that women start to join the library because he feels they'll then take on middle management positions, and then men won't be able to go for the top jobs because they haven't been able to get the experience, So there's all this stuff about, but women really by the sort of 1920s are really at the kind of intellectual heart of the library. But there is this strong sense that when it begins, the Mitchell Library opens in 1910, that this is the national library, and it has ambitions beyond anything that State Library Victoria might do, or any of the other libraries. And for a while the library's writing to the other states saying, look, you can have stuff, but let us know, and if it's important, we'll take it and we'll give you what's left, kind of thing. And everyone ignores it. But there is this sense that this library is the national repository. And it does focus very much on kind of imperial history. And that is what appears in the press. That's what everyone gets excited about. And there's a lot of press, you go through Trove, the library gets a lot of mentions. But underneath it is just the consistent, ongoing collection of things that are published. And I suppose as we've come into the 20th and 21st century, we are probably even more aware of those gaps. So a lot of what we do now is trying to address, say, First Nations issues, or the lack of First Nation representation in our collections, multicultural collections. We often have in terms of ephemera that's published by community groups, for instance, but we don't necessarily have the voices, so you're trying to actively acquire those kind of things. So, but they're kind of questions that we've always had. They've just probably got different complexions, and I think that's kind of what makes the place so interesting, I think, and why so many of us never seem to leave. It is, I will leave, don't worry, but it is kind of, it's like exploring a new terrain, a new country, and people dive into the collections and find different things, put different eyes over collections. When I started here as a kind of researcher, as a student, not as an employee, in the early 80s, there was, people like Henry Reynolds were just writing about Aboriginal history. And all of a sudden, because someone is talking about things, you begin to see things in papers and archives and so on. And, obviously I've not really contributed to that, but when I was doing my masters, you could write because people like Reynolds were opening up ways of looking at things. And I think that has always been what has been really important about libraries and archives, is they do actually help shape the way we think about our country, because people do, from all perspectives, from all political persuasions, they come to archives and use the archives as a foundation of their records, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded of a lovely line that Thomas Keneally wrote, and his papers are here. He's done a lot of research in this place over decades, and he writes about coming here as a schoolboy, but at a library that made me live event, he read his piece, and it was very moving for the audience because he was very moved. But to your point, the final line of his piece is, if anyone ever has a sense that everything is written, everything worth telling told, a day in the library will cure it.
Yes, and I think, and in a way, it's worth, I think, reflecting on why we have the libraries. So the book, as Pip said at the beginning, comprises my essay, a photo essay, just a day in the life of the library. Then the libraries that made me, they're 59, aren't they?
Yeah.
And
let's call it 60.
60, okay, we'll round it up to 60. And I think part of 200 is obviously a celebration of this library and a reflection of this library, but we also wanted libraries kind of as a genre, libraries as a genre, whatever.
As an idea.
As an idea. And so Pip, maybe you can talk about some of how that got together.
Yeah, well, I started working at the library towards the end of 2021 as the editor of Open Book magazine that I'm sure many of you know and enjoy. And I had an idea for a column that I thought would work really well in the magazine. And the idea came from a very specific source. And I haven't talked about this very much, but some of you may know the American nonfiction writer Susan Orlean, who wrote a book called The Orchid Thief that you may have read. She's a really brilliant nonfiction writer, and I am a big fan of hers. So when I was offered this job at the library, I felt compelled to read what was then a fairly recent book by Susan Orlean called The Library Book. And I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's partly a kind of a tribute to her mother. She grew up in Ohio and was a member of a branch library in Cleveland. But the heart of the book is actually a very confronting, close, carefully told story about the Los Angeles Public Library and how it developed and how part of it burnt down in the 1980s. But there is a line in Susan Orlean's latest book. I'm really sounding like a huge fangirl. But she writes, reflecting on her book, The Library Book, I was transported to an enchanted place in my memory of being with my mother, of quickening at the sight of all these books, all these stories that would be mine. And she writes, as the poet Louise Gluck wrote in her poem Nostos, we look at the world once in childhood, the rest is memory. And then this is back to Susan. Being in the library was a fusion of those two views, one original and intimate, the other memory. And that really lodged in my mind because it made me think about the the library that kind of made me, which is the Maroubra Junction Library in Sydney. And I thought, I bet lots of other people have really formative libraries that shaped who they became, particularly if they turned out to be writers. But I thought, most of us have some kind of connection with a library, whether it's a local municipal library of the kind that blossomed around the country as part of post-war reconstruction, whether it's a school library or a university library. And I thought, well, that would be a really, excellent prompt for all kinds of people to write about the library that made them. And the first one was by Kate Evans, the ABC broadcaster, and it was really good. I thought that she would write about Dapto Library, which is where she grew up, but she writes about the Mitchell Library Reading Room, where she researched her PhD, and really she's writing about serendipitous connections that she discovered in the card catalogue and the way that helped her while she was doing research into her PhD, which was about photojournalism in Australia, but trained her to think in a certain way. And I thought, this is really quite interesting and profound. So it became a regular part of the magazine. And I think by the time we talked about the book and maybe calling the book, at first I thought it could perhaps be called The Libraries That Made Us, but it became The Library That Made Me. I had maybe commissioned and published around 15, so I had to get my skates on and commission a whole lot more. But what I adore about these pieces is that I never know what I'm going to get. So I'll invite someone and I think, oh, well, they'll probably write about the library in Carlton, or it will be about, where they went to school because they've written a book about going to school, and it will end up being something completely different and quite unexpected. So that's been a joy.
And I think it's a really important part of the book in a way, isn't it? Because we do want, we're obviously very attached to this library, and it's the focus of 200 in a sense is about this library, although there are opportunities for, if you go to the website, you can participate. You can actually put your own little story, up to 400 words, in a portal about the library that has made you, and we'd obviously encourage you to do that.
And also the column became a literal column.
Yes.
So if you go to 1 Elizabeth Street above the Martin Place Metro, there's an audio lounge which has these big columns covered in the Library That Made Me paraphernalia, and you can listen to some of the contributors to the book read it. So I never expected that.
No. And it is a really, they are all so different, which I think is what makes it such an engrossing read. Did people say no to you? Does anyone say no to you?
Not many. And you and I both know of a fairly prominent ABC radio announcer who regrets now having said no.
I was about to reveal their gender. I should say they said no. But they saw the book and said, oh no, it looks so good. So I felt sufficiently, I don't want to say what I felt.
But in general, people have said yes because it's not onerous. What has struck me is that people love libraries, and it's a positive story by and large. There are dark elements to many of these stories, so often libraries become places of refuge from difficult situations, whether it's being bullied in the playground or challenges at home. A library can be a source of safety and refuge, and we know that that's the case in public libraries across the state and elsewhere. But in general, apart from a few run-ins with librarians who may not have been so friendly to children, the stories are full of love and relief, and the word inspiration and possibility and discovery, all those kinds of words appear really frequently through all these pieces, but also transformation, like all these writers who are, you know, well known to us, whether Winnie Dunn, Linda Javen, Lee Kaufman, a whole lot of writers started thinking, well, maybe I could be a librarian, and that was an aspirational thing. And then they think, actually, maybe I could be a writer myself. So that kind of life journey I find really moving. And the other thing that comes through so many of the libraries that made me is the life cycle, where people reflect on their own parents or grandparents. Anne Summers writes about her grandmother taking her to the library in Adelaide, which took 3 bus trips. She writes about researching Dam Tours and God's Police in this case, and the picture that she paints of libraries across the course of her life is really quite profound. But very often people write about then taking their own children to the library for story time or to study for the HSC or whatever it might be. So the role that these public spaces can play across the life cycle is something that I think it's good to remind people we should not take for granted.
And I certainly think, these days, if you go into the Mitchell Reading Room or into the new recently renovated State Reference Library, you certainly see that possibly the thing that is most used by many of our readers is in fact the Wi-Fi, and they're sort of doing their own work. But I think libraries do become this kind of third space, it's often talked about, where people like being with people. I mean, there's something essentially good about sitting in a quiet space with people, doing your own thing, and that's perfectly acceptable. And I suppose in a way, since technology has begun to kind of impact the way we do things so much, in the 1980s, if you wanted to know who won the Melbourne Cup in whatever year, you really had to go to the library. And these days, you can type it into your phone and the answer comes back to you in milliseconds. So the library's function as a kind of information repository has changed somewhat, I think. And for this library, I think it means that we've probably lent in more to our historical and cultural, we've got more exhibition spaces here, I think, perhaps than any other library in the world, I would argue. With the kind of, and so our fellowship program expands, we've kind of not completely changed, but we've changed direction, I think, a bit. And it makes, it's just libraries have always changed. They've always adapted. And I think people think, oh, libraries never change. But they're a constant process of evolution, response to technology. I mean, God knows what's going to happen with things like AI, and that's the search power of AI is extraordinary, can be extraordinary, but it can also make shit up kind of thing, make stuff up, and that then enters into the, and we find, I think it's about 30% of the, I think I'm getting this right, 30% of the visits to our website from China, from bots from China who are scraping the site. They're AI, and it's all quite legitimate. I mean, it's not evil, Communist Party people kind of trying to steal information. It's just what now happens. And, so we are having to deal with yet another. I mean, when I came here in 1990, I didn't have a computer on my desk. the annual report for 1985 announces with great pride the library has a fax machine, and you kind of, I think, it's just been a rapid and so in a way, in my essay, I don't actually try and predict the future because, when I came here in 1990, I would have not had the faintest sense that, we'd be sitting, even something like a camera down the back and a screen up here just wasn't around. And so how can we say what's going to happen with AI?
I think we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here and listening to this history of writing the library. I think there's a sign popping up. The book is
one outside the door.
There's one outside. The book is available, and this beautifully produced heavy book can be sent to you for free. So
$49.99.
Yes. So thank you all for coming, and thanks Richard for.
Yeah, well, thanks both of us, really. Pip has been the engine behind getting this thing together. I think people often think, what does it take to put a book together? And it takes a lot of work. So thank you.
Thank you.